David Stewart here. It's time for part 2 of my story crafting series, my series on how to write a good story. And this video is going to focus on settings, what kind of settings you can put your story into. At the outset of creation, setting is probably the most important decision you can make because the setting contains not only the location of where your story is going to be, it also contains like the architecture, the weather. It also contains the culture that the characters are going to exist in, which is in turn going to shape their attitudes and change what they view as all the possibilities for what they can do in a plot. So before you do anything else, you really ought to decide just sort of what your setting is going to be. With that in mind, I like to think of setting as like a big construction set. In it is contained all the pieces that you need to build whatever world you want to build for your characters to live in. So with that, let's take a look at one of my favorite things, Legos. Okay, this is the way most people view setting as a location, and we have, we've got some rocks and maybe a couple parapets there. We've got some flora and some grass, and they think that's the setting. But the setting contains more than that, because the setting is going to also contain the architecture of your story. It's also going to contain the buildings that your story is using. Okay, so in this case, let's imagine we're going to create a story that is set in like a medieval, your standard medieval England or Europe sort of setting. We have a nice stone building that's fortified. We have a little parapet on top. It's flying a banner, and it's also got a thatch roof. I don't have anything that really looks like a thatch roof, so I just kind of put some greenery on it. And that's more or less what sort of architecture we might expect in a medieval European setting. In this case, their flag is kind of reminiscent of the Welsh flag, so let's just say that it's in Wales, shall we? Now also contained, besides the architecture, besides the fauna and the flora, is also some of the characters that are going to exist in our setting. So let's go ahead, let's add some standard sort of military units, okay? Because a good story is probably going to have a lot of conflict. We might have some military conflict. We've got crossbowmen and a dude with a short sword and a shield. And that's going to be some of our standard ground units that we're going to operate with. Also contained in the setting are going to be, your peasants. You might have a couple peasants hanging about. You might have, this Robin Hood looking character, some bandits, whatever they're going to be. You're also going to have maybe, the culture's view of how women ought to dress. So female characters are going to look a particular way. And now we have a nice medieval setting. We also might add into it, a knight. We can add a knight in. Oh, here we go. Here's a knight. Okay. Now, this is all stuff that a viewer or listener might be very, very familiar with, but at the same time, we also want to do some new stuff. So we can do like maybe a couple things that are a little bit out of the ordinary. We can make that knight into a woman. That's something that's a little bit different, but is also something that we might really like to see. So there we go. There's our little medieval setting. It contains our characters, it contains our landscape, it contains our architecture. But we can keep adding to this, right? So what if we add, dun, 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 we'll add a dragon. Oh my gosh, a dragon. All right, now we've actually crossed a line. Okay, at this point, we're no longer operating in a standard medieval setting. Once we add dragons into it, we're operating in a fantasy setting. And that line that we've crossed is the line between plausibility and implausibility. And I don't quite like to use those terms because I like to think of a fantasy setting, the story is plausible within its world. But within our world, dragons are not really plausible or possible. They don't exist. So as soon as you add a dragon, you know that you're not in sort of the standard real world. You're now in a fantasy setting. Okay, a fantasy setting is going to have its own rules. It's going to have its own operating behaviors. Now, once we add that dragon in, we actually have to do a lot of extra writing, right? Because if there's a dragon, that means the characters know that there's a dragon, or they believe in dragons because they interact with dragons, and that's going to change all of their attitudes about everyday life. If dragons are a real threat, that changes a little bit about your setting. You might have to fortify things more. You might have different defenses. You might have to build defenses against dragons, however it's going to be. However, once we're in a fantasy setting, now things are a little bit more wide open. We don't have to have your standard peasants that existed in medieval Wales, we can add in, a wizard to fight the dragon. Why not? Okay, so we'll add in a wizard to our now fantastical version of medieval Wales. And we've got a wizard with a crystal and a magic wand, and he can fight the dragon. But we have to do some more world building, because if wizards are real, then people are also going to have a different attitude towards wizards. So every fantastical element that you add into a setting, you have to do what's called world building for. You have to create some exposition that explains to the reader, explains to the viewer, explains to whoever is experiencing the story just how that particular fantastic element works, what its limits are, what its capacities are, what its dangers are. And all of that is necessary for that story to feel immersive and for the reader or the viewer to feel that there's danger for the characters and that the whole thing is consistent and coherent. Now, we could keep adding to this. What if we add something that is really different? Uh-oh. Oh, man. We're just going to add Darth Vader into this? No. Man, I think we've crossed another line, and I'll explain that line in a second. But Darth Vader, he has no place in a medieval fantasy setting, right? He's from a galaxy far, far away. What's Darth Vader doing here, right? Well, if Darth Vader's there, we might as well have our original Return of the Jedi Luke with an M16 to fight him. Very nice. Okay. Uh-oh. By the way, that is the original Return of the Jedi toy from when I was a child. And at this point, we might just have the end of Monty Python and have our policeman come in and try to put a halt to everything. At this point, we've definitely crossed another line, and that line is a line between fantasy, which has its own sort of rules, and Bizarro, which Bizarro has no rules. Okay, that's the dividing line. Bizarro fiction is its own kind of fiction. It is a genre of fiction, and in this case, it's a setting, because the setting doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't have any sort of coherency or consistency, and that might be intentional. You might create a Bizarro story that intentionally does not have any kind of internal consistency or coherency. So the next thing that I am going to show you guys is a little bit of how I view some of the different categories of these settings. And I am going to use some terms that are basically the same as styles and as genres, but let's not look at them as styles or genres. Let's look at them as types of settings. Okay, so the first type of setting is what I really call realist setting. Now, I know realism is also a style that emerged in the 19th century, but for this purpose, we're going to call realist a setting. A realist setting is something that takes place in the real world. It conforms to our reality, the reality that the viewer, that the reader is familiar with. Okay, fantasy conforms to a different reality, a reality that the viewer or the reader might not be familiar with. And generally, the rule of thumb with that is the fantastical elements need to be world builded, they need to be explained, and the other elements can conform to the reality that we're familiar with, right? You don't have to explain why people don't fall up into the sky. You presume that if it's not explained, that it's going to operate under sort of normal circumstances. And the third one is Bizarro, which conforms to no reality. In Bizarro, you could just float up to the sky, and that could happen in a Bizarro story. There are no rules. There's nothing restricting the direction of the plot. And that sort of has its own virtues as an odd little genre. I'm not super into Bizarro fiction, so those of you who are, you can inform me as to what you really like about Bizarro fiction. But for a setting, a Bizarro setting is something that doesn't have that consistency and doesn't seek to have internal consistency of any kind, right? Now, I'm just going to look at realism and fantasy for a second because it's important to understand a couple of different categories of each of these. So the big realist setting categories that I think of are contemporary realism. Contemporary takes place in the here and now. So it's written in the now and it takes place in the now. If you set a story in Boston in 2015, it's contemporary even though 2015 was last year. The setting is still essentially the same. Society hasn't changed that much. If you set it in even Boston in 1980, it might still be considered contemporary because the culture, even though they didn't have the internet and stuff, it's still pretty much the same culture, and people that were born recently will still have an idea of what those characters may be doing in 1980. So that might still be contemporary. Historical fiction is written right now, but it takes place in the past. And this is a genre of fiction as well as historical fiction. So if you write about a character in Queen Elizabeth I's court, you're writing historical fiction, and your construction set's going to include all the characters, all the sort of social norms, all the culture that existed in that period in English history, as well as the locations, the architecture, and that sort of stuff. So historical fiction requires a lot of knowledge of that particular time period. You may have to do some world building if you're writing historical fiction, because not everyone is familiar with how architecture in the 16th century happened to work. Okay. The third one that I really throw in here is what I call period fiction. Period was written in the past and it takes place in the past. So Charles Dickens would be period fiction. And the reason I've set that as a separate little category is that historical fiction is written by somebody who has our familiar understanding of culture and is writing about really a different culture, a past culture. And so they are automatically have a lens to help translate what's happening in the past into something that's understandable for a modern reader. Period fiction doesn't have that lens because Charles Dickens was writing in the mid-19th century and his stories were taking place in the mid-19th century, which really meant that he wasn't creating any kind of translations. He wasn't helping to bridge any gaps of knowledge for anyone that happens to live in the 21st century. So when you're reading period fiction, you really have to sometimes be willing to do a little bit of extra research to figure out exactly what that writer might be meaning in that particular time period. So I really view it as a little bit different simply because the writing style is very different. Obviously, you're not going to be writing, I don't know, someone could attempt to write modern period fiction, but I don't know, I'm not aware of any examples. If you know of some, you could certainly enlighten me. Now, for fantasy, there's three big areas of fantasy I think about. First one's low fantasy. Low fantasy is set in our world, but it has some extra elements. So if it's our world plus wizards, that's low fantasy. If it's our world plus vampires and werewolves, that's low fantasy. If it is a different world with wizards, then we're dealing with the second one, which is high fantasy. High fantasy is set in a whole new world, new locations, sometimes different laws of physics. Sometimes there's magic, right? So low fantasy might have magic and a new world. High fantasy would have magic and a new world. So low fantasy would have our world with magic. High fantasy would be a new world with magic, but you don't necessarily have to have magic in high fantasy. It just has to be a new world with different sort of imaginary cultures, different imaginary locations. That's really what high fantasy is. And the third one, I'm just going to put science fiction under here. Some people may argue that science fiction does not deserve a category under fantasy, that it's something different. But because we're dealing with things that don't exist and aren't plausible in the here and now, I think it's kind of a subgenre of fantasy, or at least as far as setting goes, it's a subsetting of fantasy. Because we're dealing with the future of our world where there's technology that doesn't exist yet. There's things that don't exist yet, like interstellar travel. And all of those are usually going to affect what the characters view. In fact, most good science fiction stories are about man's interaction with that progression of technology. That's a really, really common theme in genre science fiction. Let's talk about a couple of examples of each of these. By the way, Bizarro doesn't really fit into any of this. Bizarro may take place in a historical period. There may be time-traveling Hitler. There may be Darth Vader comes out of the sky and shoots rainbows out of his lightsaber, right? There's no particular rule set, and there's no real need for world building in Bizarro. You can have anything happen at any time. That's part of what makes that genre work. Okay, here's some examples of low fantasy. Harry Potter is technically low fantasy. You have our world plus wizards. And yeah, they have their own school and a castle, but they come in our world. They drive cars. They ride on trains. They go to places in our world. Harry Potter is low fantasy. By the way, just let me interject. Low fantasy does not mean like lower and worse than high fantasy. It just means it's just something different. It just means our world, right? Okay. Dresden Files is wizards plus our world, along with other magical creatures, including werewolves. These are books written by Jim Butcher. First one was called Stormfront, and they're very, very popular fiction. They're not really high fantasy because they are in our world, even though there's tons of fantasy elements. You still have Harry Dresden walking around Chicago. What is just Chicago? It's not Chicago with, magical floating buildings. It's just Chicago plus a wizard. So that's really low fantasy. Okay. Vampire Chronicles are also low fantasy. That's the Anne Rice series. Because you essentially have our world, even though you have our world in different historical periods, you still have our world plus vampires. We're operating under all the normal assumptions about how our world works and how people's attitudes toward things are, but there's vampires. And because the vampires aren't really known about by normal people are not going to have any kind of particular special idea of how vampires are going to affect their life. Okay, mythology is also an example of low fantasy in this particular discussion. And that's because we're dealing with the real world. We're dealing with real locations. We're dealing with things that are familiar. But we have extra elements that are fantasy. You have krakens and you have frost giants or whatever else. So Ring of the Nibelung is a good example of that. That's by Richard Wagner, famous three-night opera of epic proportions that inspired so many fantasy writers to follow. Definitely recommend finding a good version of that if you've never heard or watched a production of Ring of the Nibelung. Supernatural horror is low fantasy, so most Stephen King horror books are going to be low fantasy. That includes like The Shining, It, even The Stand. You have our world, plus you have magical elements. You have horrible monsters that are added into our world. You have vampires that are added into our world, or you have our world plus a plague plus, demons that are immortal and can teleport. That's The Stand, right? So most supernatural horror is going to be Stephen King type horror is going to be low fantasy. Historical fantasy is another genre, but it is a setting as well. So historical fantasy is like what we were doing with the Welsh example. So if we go back and look at the Welsh example, minus, of course, Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. So if we take those two out, we'll take away my Return of the Jedi toy, which looks nothing like Mark Hamill, by the way. I mean, it just doesn't look anything like him. There he is. Wow. Hey, dude, you don't look anything like Mark Hamill. I don't know what you look like, but not Mark. We take away him. We take away our Monty Python policemen, and we take away Vader, and now we have our Welsh fantasy setting. Woo! All right, that's an example of historical fantasy. It takes place like in medieval Europe, but we have dragons. I wrote a book called Muramasa Blood Drinker that takes place at the end of the Muromachi period in Japan and has things like demon swords, right? It has fantasy elements in it. So that's an example of historical fantasy as well. Lastly, I'm going to just throw it under here is alternate history. Alternate history books, I haven't really read much of them. So those of you who are bigger fans of them can, of course, argue this. But I'm putting them under low fantasy because it's our world with a big change that has caused our world to be different. But we still have like a common history with that alternate history, right? Wherever the alternate history started happening, before that, we have the same culture that we are normally used to. So if it's like, this is an alternate history where the South won the Civil War, your culture may not be profoundly different than it would be now, especially if you were in the North, but it's going to be different. But prior to the Civil War, you guys are going to have the same thing. You're going to revere like the same ideas. So alternate history, I am going to throw under low fantasy. You guys are welcome to argue with me about it, and I'm happy to entertain whatever maxims you have. You can only hone a razor by sharpening it against a stone. Let's look at some high fantasy examples. These are very, very popular ideas. The biggest one's probably Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is the classic example of high fantasy. Middle-earth is a brave new world. It has different locations, different beasts, different races. Everything in it is new and different and not from our world, even though it's very reminiscent of European mythology. Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan's another example. That is a very, very long epic series. Not on this list, but worthy of mention is Malazan Book of the Fallen. That's also high fantasy. That is a different world from ours with its own rules and its own history and its own cultures that are imaginary and different from ours. Okay? Star Wars, I'm going to throw under the high fantasy because it's a galaxy far, far away. It's not our galaxy. It's a galaxy far, far away. It has a different culture. It has different aliens. It has different technology. It has a different language. There's people out there, I think, who know like the language from Star Wars. So it has its own language. It has everything in it is its own. It even has magic. So to me, Star Wars is definitely high fantasy. It is not science fiction, but there are science fiction elements in it. And feel free to debate me on this because I really want to know what your perspective is on Star Wars and the fact that it might be science fiction or fantasy. Earthsea, which are the Ursula Le Guin books, are another classic example of high fantasy and definitely worth reading. This is kind of like it's almost like a reading list here. Song of Ice and Fire, which is Game of Thrones, same thing. That's what's popular on HBO right now. That's an example of high fantasy. It's your standard medieval setting, but everything's new. Westeros is not Europe. It has its own set of rules, its own locations, so it's high fantasy. The Elric Saga by Michael Moorcock, very, very famous piece of fiction. That is high fantasy, most of it. There are actually, in his sort of multiverse thing, there are things that definitely qualify as low fantasy that take place in alternate Europes and things like that. But the Elric Saga is really high fantasy. And the Narnia books, so Chronicles of Narnia, those are really high fantasy as well. Even though our characters are going from our world into Narnia, it doesn't qualify as low fantasy because the world that they're adventuring in, Narnia, is a new world. It's not our world. So that really becomes high fantasy rather than low fantasy. Also, Narnia doesn't interact with our world. It doesn't have any effect on our world. So it's not really, it's just a way of taking our characters from our world into that world. Also worth noting with this is the Mark Twain book, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. This is actually historical fantasy. It's not high fantasy. We're taking a character from our world and putting him in the past, but it's a fantastical version of the past. So that's one that is definitely, in my opinion, has a low fantasy setting. And then some examples of science fiction include Star Trek. Star Trek is about technology. It's about the future of our world. It's about the consequences of technology like interstellar travel. It's definitely a science fiction setting. Dune is a science fiction setting, but might be pushing that boundary into fantasy because it's set so far in the future that Earth is like irrelevant, right? And our culture is unrecognizable in any kind of sense. So that might actually be pushing that little line over into fantasy. Plus we have like people becoming sandworms, and that's definitely has some fantasy elements. Ender's Game and Speaker of the Dead, that's a sci-fi example. Atlas Shrugged, as far as the setting is concerned, is an example of science fiction. It takes place in our future with a slightly different set of technology and a different political climate. The setting is science fiction. I would not call it genre science fiction, but some people may argue that Atlas Shrugged is actually genre science fiction. It has a lot in common with genre science fiction. And The Forever War is a good example of science fiction. The technology is really limited by the science that we understand in our world. That's a really common thing with the science fiction setting. Starship Troopers, both the movie and the book, and I did a review on those that I could probably link. That is an example of science fiction. Snow Crash, another recent example of science fiction. Bizarro Examples, I don't read a lot of Bizarro fiction, so these are just some of the ones that I know of. Ask Goblins of Auschwitz is a zany and bizarre book. The Haunted Vagina is another very popular one. Both of those are very crazy, but the third one on the list, Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, that is a Bizarro book, but it is a little more serious. It's not intended to be quite as outlandish. Ask Goblins of Auschwitz is really funny to me and disturbing, but those have a different sort of goal, each of those ones. That's going to basically be our overview of setting. Again, I like to think of it as a construction set. Contained in the setting is the location, the architecture, the weather, the plants that you're going to encounter, the cultures that the characters are born out of, and all the locations that they are going to interact with, which is in turn going to limit and control the direction of your plot. So thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you are interested in finding me outside of YouTube, you can find my website. It's dvspress.com and davidvstewart.com. DVS Press has all of my, not all of my stuff, but it has books, my books that you can read, which I'm happy to have you take a look at. And davidvstewart.com is going to have most of my, it's an ongoing project, but it's going to have most of my YouTube stuff organized and most of my guitar stuff. Thanks for watching. Please let me know what you think, and please do not hesitate to give me suggestions on what I ought to be doing with this channel. I am always happy to listen, and I am always happy to improve. Thank you so much and have a great day.